This is an LA Times Studios podcast.
Hey, it's Christopher Goffard with LA Times Studios. We're excited to bring you a podcast version of my written series, Crimes of the Times. Video episodes will be available here on YouTube, and you can also hear them wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you enjoy the first episode of Crimes of the Times. In 1991, Los Angeles County Deputy District Attorney Marcia Clark was preparing to prosecute a man for the murder of a young actress he had become obsessed with. There was no doubt that he had done it. He gave a detailed confession to a psychiatrist, explaining how he confronted the victim at her home in West Hollywood.
In the middle of the tape, as he's talking about what happened at the door, something bothered me about his physical gestures.
Clark studied the man's confession, taking notes.
And I thought, something's weird here. And I kept stopping and replaying and stopping and replaying. And then I realized what it was.
From LA Times Studios, this is Crimes of the Times. I'm Christopher Goffard. I've been covering crime and the justice system for most of my career. My prior podcasts have explored cases that had not been well known: Dirty John, Detective Trapp, and the trials of Frank Carson. What we're doing here is a little different. We're looking at older criminal cases in Los Angeles and beyond. Some of them were famous in their day, but the details are dim in memory. Some of them were hugely consequential, as in today's episode, and we will explore why. Some cases are obscure, but deserve not to be. There will be cult murders and killer cops, would-be assassins and domestic terrorists, Hollywood movie set disasters, and fallen tycoons. I'll be talking to the people who know these cases best, and whenever possible, the people who live them. Welcome to Crimes of the Times. When people think of Marcia Clark, they probably remember her from the O.J. Simpson murder trial in 1995. It made her a household name. But the killing of 21-year-old actress Rebecca Schaeffer by a 19-year-old man named Robert Bardo a few years earlier would be a far more significant case in actually reforming the legal landscape. It led to an explosion of anti-stalking laws that are taken for granted today. In terms of impact, there are only a handful of criminal cases that come close. Rebecca Schaeffer became famous playing a bubbly, innocent teenager on the sitcom My Sister Sam, which ran from 1986 to 1988. Her co-star was Pam Dauber from Mork and Mindy. Robert Bardo was a high school dropout from Tucson, Arizona, a misfit. He worked the grill at a Jack in the Box, but he could not hold a job for long. Bardo became fixated on Schaeffer. He taped every episode of My Sister Sam. He began writing to her. Once, she sent him a personalized response.
It was very neutral. It wasn't in the least romantic or even particularly affectionate. Not at all.
Schaeffer's friends had warned her that even the most innocuous personal note could be misinterpreted, and her note seemed to inflame Bardo's fixation. He kept writing. Some of his letters quoted John Lennon lyrics. Schaeffer's father was a psychologist in Portland, Oregon, and when he read Bardo's letters, he did not see a threat in them. He thought they reflected what he called just another strange kid who wanted someone to pay attention to him. One day, Bardo took a Greyhound to Los Angeles, rented a cheap hotel, and found his way to the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank, where they were taping My Sister Sam. He had flowers and a teddy bear. He insisted on seeing Schaeffer. A security guard went out of his way to drive Bardo back to his hotel and told him to go home to Tucson. The guard thought this was just another harmless, lovesick fan wanting to see a star. It was common. There were a couple of this type every week. But Bardo remained fixated on Schaeffer. He wrote to his sister, "I have an obsession with the unobtainable." When Rebecca Schaeffer appeared in a love scene in the film Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills, something shifted in the man who had been stalking her. Robert Bardo said he felt betrayed. Marcia Clark told me that when she got the case, she consulted with Gavin DeBecker, a security specialist who studied stalkers. He explained the nature of their obsessions and motivations.
There's going to be a trigger at some point. That's the inevitable outcome of these kinds of delusional connections.
Bardo did not know the actress, did not love her. She was pixels on a TV screen.
So that trigger that makes them turn on the object of their quote-unquote affection and decide that this person has gone from angel or perfection to demon to awful. And it is arbitrary. It can be anything of their choosing that makes them suddenly change and decide that they're going to act out this way. And I don't know necessarily they all turn homicidal. The worst of them do, but it can just turn into harassment as well.
Bardo had studied other celebrity stalkers and seemed to take cues from them. He visited the apartment building in New York where a deranged fan murdered John Lennon. Rebecca Schaeffer was not the first victim Bardo stalked. There were other young female celebrities, too. He tried to find the pop stars Debbie Gibson and Tiffany. He tried to find Samantha Smith, the girl who had written to the Soviet premier in a plea for peace. But Schaeffer was the one Bardo was able to find. He'd read a story about the man who stabbed and nearly killed actress Teresa Saldana, and he realized that he could hire someone to lead him to Schaeffer. So he paid $250 to a private investigator who got her home address from the DMV. Then he took another Greyhound to Los Angeles, this time with a .357 Magnum his brother had purchased for him. On the morning of July 18, 1989, Schaeffer was preparing to audition for a role in The Godfather Part 3. Bardo appeared outside the door of her apartment on North Sweetser Avenue in West Hollywood. She opened the door, and he fired a bullet through her heart. He ran off in flip-flops. He was carrying a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, and he threw it onto a rooftop. The number of dangerous people who carry that book around is very strange. I mean, Mark David Chapman, John Hinckley, this guy. I don't know why that book seems to pop up over and over.
But you do, because the first one did it. I think it was Mark David Chapman or John Hinckley. It might be Hinckley. Whichever one was first in time, the others copy them. And this was something I talked to Gavin about. I said, I don't even know that Bardo ever read Catcher in the Rye. He was just carrying the book because he'd read other stalkers who were carrying the book. And this copycat effort is something that is very common. So they kind of see themselves as part of a sect of people, and there is this effort to emulate the others who have gone before.
My theory was, look, it's a popular book. Everybody reads it in high school. It's about alienation. It's about a guy who doesn't quite fit in. Mm-hmm. Maybe they in some way relate to Holden Caulfield and his estrangement from mainstream society. But now you're telling me it's a whole different thing. It's more just a token or a badge or a almost like a piece of clothing that they wear that gives them a sense of connection to the prior guy who did it. And the content of the book itself is almost irrelevant, it sounds like.
Well, I can't say that for sure. And it might be both. They might identify with Holden Caulfield and might also have thought about getting the book because of prior stalkers and then read it and thought, I get why somebody was carrying it. I think so too. That might also be that they simply picked up the book because they knew another stalker had carried it. But I do think there is an element of copycatism regardless.
The day after the shooting, police in Tucson found Robert Bardo running in freeway traffic, apparently trying to kill himself. When they grabbed him, he put his head on a squad car and sobbed and said he'd shot someone. From his cell in the psychiatric ward of the Los Angeles County Jail, Bardo spoke by phone to a reporter from the Oregonian in Portland and said, My feelings for her were uncontrollable. I was a fan of hers, and I may have carried it too far. His trial began more than 2 years after the shooting. Marcia Clark's goal was to prove that he was guilty of first-degree murder and send him away for life. Bardo's public defender argued for second-degree murder. The defense was that he had acted on impulse rather than with premeditation. If that argument prevailed, Bardo might one day walk free. This is where Bardo's tape confession turned out to be key. He had made the confession to a court-appointed psychiatrist who was interviewing him at Men's Central Jail.
I thought, something's weird here. And I kept stopping and replaying and stopping and replaying. And then I realized what it was.
Clark analyzed the killer's words and body language. Something about them troubled her. Something about them did not match. She thought he was lying. About what, she couldn't exactly say, but she was determined to find out. It's an incredibly disturbing tape. Bardo speaks with a kind of manic intensity. He has an unnerving streak of braggadocio. He says Schaeffer had become, quote, the most important thing in my life, and that he came to L.A. with a mission. He still seems amazed that Schaeffer had answered the door. He says, "It's her. There she is. She's right there in front of me. She wasn't dressed up glamorously, just a regular person, just me and her." They chatted briefly. He says she smiled and told him to take care, that he left and later came back, and this time Schaeffer seemed annoyed. This, Bardo claims, was what provoked him. She told him to hurry up, which he said was, quote, a very callous thing to say to a fan. Bardo mimics pulling the gun from his shopping bag and shooting her. He does it like he's bragging about an impressive sporting feat. Marcia Clark watched the tape to the end. She was convinced that this was not an impulse act, but the result of planning and premeditation.
He didn't know she would open the door at that time. And he gave her, I think, a CD or something. And she said, thank you, and something along the lines of, I'm in a hurry. And she was in a hurry. She was getting ready for an audition and left and went back to her apartment. He went to a diner and thought about what had happened, went into the men's room, and then made sure the gun was loaded and went back to her apartment, now aware that she was going to answer the door. So I knew all of that when I was looking at the tape. When he came to the door, he had his hand behind his back. The gun was in his hand, and he showed how he brandished his gun from behind his back to shoot her. And that was the moment when I realized that's the lying in wait, that's the ambush. She couldn't see that he was armed when she came to the door. He hid it from her. He hid his purpose, and that's lying in wait.
So there's a misapprehension, I guess, in the popular mind that lying in wait means you're hiding behind a tree or crouched behind a car or whatever. But in this case, In this case, it was the murder weapon. But the more important part of that was the intention to conceal purpose so that the person is taken off guard, so that the person is ambushed. So you don't have to jump out from behind the bushes and you don't have to hide behind a tree. If you approach in a manner that is going to lure the person innocently to believe that you are just there to say hello or give them, at that time, I think he had a teddy bear with him that he was holding out and purporting to give her a gift. So he was deceiving her in his purpose. The concealment of purpose is what makes it lying in wait.
The tape showed that he'd been planning the murder before she had supposedly acted dismissively toward him, before there was anything he could call provocation. And he had come from Tucson with a gun.
I should also add that just before he went to Rebecca's door for the last time, he called his sister back in Tucson and said, you're going to hear something about me. Something big is going to happen. She didn't know what he was referring to. She told him, come home, just come home. Don't do anything. Come home. So he had already decided what he was going to do. It was very clear.
At the trial, Bardo's defense attorney portrayed him as a victim of mental illness and parental neglect. The psychiatrist for the defense, Park Dietz, testified that Bardo was, quote, a sick young man who suffered from schizophrenia and wanted to be famous. A movie star, writer, or musician, maybe all of them, Dietz recalled him saying. Bardo's high school counselor read excerpts of letters that Bardo had written in his mid-teens saying, "The people at school did a good job of stopping me from killing myself. They made a mistake because they saved the devil. Now the devil must kill. I'm going to be the next Hitler." Robert Bardo had waived a jury trial, so his public defender was making the argument directly to a judge whose name was Dino Fulgoni. The defense attorney played a song for the court that he said had triggered Bardo. It was called Exit from the U2 album The Joshua Tree. It's about the mind of a homicidal man, and it had the lyric, quote, "The pistol weighed heavy."
He played it very loud in the courtroom to show the judge, basically to show his mental disorder. And he began rocking back and forth vigorously in time to the music and was deep into it, very deep into it. And, one could surmise that it was an act, but I didn't. I thought he really is somehow triggered by this song, by this music. And the point to be made here is that no one's saying that he is perfectly rational and perfectly mentally healthy. No one's saying that. There is certainly something wrong with him. The question is whether the mental state that he was in precluded him from understanding the nature and quality of his act. Did he understand that what he was doing was luring Rebecca out into a vulnerable position so he could kill her? Yes, he certainly did know that. He certainly understood that, and everything he wrote and everything he did showed a very clear awareness of that. But that is not to say that he's completely mentally healthy. He clearly is not. I understood why the defense wanted to show that behavior, but that behavior doesn't show that he doesn't know what he's doing. And that is the legal borderline for what is at issue here.
Clark argued that Bardo killed Schaeffer for fame, and that when he gunned the actress down, he had not been under the influence of any command delusions, such as voices ordering him to kill.
One thing you mentioned when you were making your case to the judge is that Robert Bardo wanted to be famous for killing Rebecca Schaeffer. Now, how do you reconcile that with the other motive that he had, which is punishing a person who he thought had somehow in his delusions betrayed him? Are those necessarily incompatible motives, or do they go together in your mind?
I think they go together. I don't think they're incompatible at all. But I do think the primary motive has always been to achieve some form of importance and fame by attaching to a celebrity who has it all. They establish a connection that makes them feel big and makes them feel important and famous, and then capitalize on that by committing some heinous act against the celebrity, because then their name will always be associated with that celebrity. You will think of Rebecca Schaeffer, and then you will immediately think of Bardo, which is why I tried to use his name as little as possible to prevent that link, but there's no really preventing it.
Ultimately, the judge agreed that Schaeffer's killer had lain in wait, that he may have had schizophrenia, but his condition did not preclude premeditation. The judge sentenced Bardo to life without the possibility of parole. In 2007, at Mule Creek State Prison, another inmate stabbed him 11 times. He survived. Robert Bardo is now 54, and he's in a cell at Avenal State Prison. He is attempting to refashion himself as a helpful expert in the psychological derangements he came to embody. In early 2024, he wrote to Joseph DeLue, a Laguna Hills private investigator and threat assessment expert he saw on a TMZ special called Obsessed and Dangerous. It was about Hollywood stalkers. I asked DeLue to read me Bardo's letter. It has a boastful tone and is full of personal grievances and therapeutic platitudes.
I am in prison for an infamous, notorious case involving Hollywood. I wish to, with your permission, consent to correspond with you on this issue of stalking behavior to offer my insights the best I can. I had tried contacting the LAPD Threat Management Unit, and they did not respond, even though I am the reason they exist. The stalker is like an asteroid on its way to Earth. Your efforts are like the little gravity nudge that safely changes its trajectory way before impact. Any way I can assist you, I would like to give it a try. Many stalkers latch on to their delusions the way Linus clings to his comfort security blanket in the Peanuts comics. It is their maladaptive coping skill to their lives. It is frightening.
DeLue told me that he consulted with a forensic psychologist and the two are making arrangements to visit Bardo in the hope that it might be useful.
We don't want to make him a celebrity, but if he's sincere about, hey, look, this is what I was going through, and he really wants to put forth his thoughts, his efforts, what he learned, we're interested in that. I am interested in that.
Marcia Clark now represents indigent clients on criminal appeals. She looks back on the Rebecca Schaeffer case and thinks about how naive people were about stalking in 1989. She includes herself. In that year, the stalking phenomenon was grasped only dimly.
I think a lot of things would happen today that wouldn't happen back then because no one knew.
Schaeffer's murder was Clark's first major case, and in ways it had a far greater impact than the one she would lose a few years later against O.J. Simpson's so-called Dream Team.
Can you talk about the long tail of this case, the ramifications of this case?
Well, in the immediate aftermath, LAPD set up a stalking unit. Laws were enacted to punish a degree of stalking that would stop them at the beginning and not wait until harm was actually done. Prior to that case, police almost had their hands tied because there was no particular crime per se in just sitting outside someone's house or outside their work, even sending them letters if they weren't threatening.
Changes came with stunning swiftness. Schaeffer's killing led California legislators to pass the nation's first laws that made stalking a crime. This inspired similar laws across the country and the world. The case also drove the LAPD to launch a threat assessment unit. This fueled the rapid growth of the private threat assessment industry, which is now enormous.
Stalking laws were enacted, units were formed in police departments, new statutes were enacted in order to try and protect people from stalkers. And that's ongoing today. It's always been the case that we would be able to prosecute someone after the harm had been committed, but we want to be able to get to them before that person is shot at or killed or hurt in some way.
Do you think that those laws are able to keep pace with the tech scene and the incredible number of ways that stalkers are able to pursue people now? For example, one of the things that came out of this case was the DMV was a lot tougher about the information they'd release. And that was considered a big victory for privacy at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But that now is almost totally irrelevant, given that with the click of the button, you can find just about anybody's address.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. That's a very poignant question because at the time it was a big deal. DMV shut down. They didn't let private investigators pay for the information. That was the funnel through which so many people got information on where others lived. But then, of course, with the internet and now all the search engines and the ability that people have to hack, even if they can't find it through legal means, is huge. And so if somebody wants to find you, really wants to find you, they're going to.
In terms of the naivete of everyone involved, you said that was what struck you about the case. When Barda goes to the studio, the guard thinks it's a lovesick fan, right? Do you think that that would evoke a whole different response today if such a guy were to come to the studio?
You bet. I think it would absolutely. They would get his name and phone number and address and track him and run him and call the cops. I think a lot of things would happen today that wouldn't happen back then because no one knew. There would be a completely different response if someone showed up the way Bardo did at the Warner Brothers Ranch. So there's an awareness now.
I asked Clark about the letter that Bardo wrote to the private investigator offering to be interviewed.
I think it is a plea for attention, obviously. I think he's still seeking publicity for himself. He wants to be famous still. He's obviously studied himself a great deal, or has studied the field anyway. I think it's worthwhile for a mental health expert to talk to him. They know better than to accept everything he says as gospel in terms of his own self-analysis. But I can see where they could learn a great deal about the way he says things, what he chooses to say, what he chooses to emphasize and not. There are all kinds of bits of information, I think, that can be gathered that could be very helpful. I think the harm would be as they then give him the attention and publicity he's seeking. I think that would be bad. And because I don't want to see other stalkers feel empowered by knowing, oh, see, he got famous. Look, he went to prison for the rest of his life, but he's still getting so much attention. This is one of the most heartbreaking cases that you can possibly have, where the victim couldn't be more innocent. And in my time investigating the case and talking to people who knew her, there was not one harsh word to be said. She was just the nicest, most delightful, lovely person. And it's a very painful loss and a senseless one.
From LA Times Studios, this is Crimes of the Times. To read more about these cases, check out Crimes of the Times at latimes.com. We also have a link to our video episodes in the show notes. This episode was written and reported by me, your host, Christopher Goffard. Our showrunner and senior producer is Jacqueline Kim. Executive editor is Cindy Chang. Production assistant is Jordan Patterson. Production services provided by JTB Studios. Our camera technicians and operators are Jeff Amlott, Julia McCabe, and Jason Newbert, with additional production support from Andrew Gombert, Patrick Stewart, and Anne-Marie Hauser. Denise Callahan is our studio manager. Ben Church is our production manager. Special thanks to LA Times Studios President Anna Magzanian, President and Chief Operating Officer of the Los Angeles Times, Chris Argenteri, and Executive Editor of the Los Angeles Times, Terry Tang. Crimes of the Times is executive produced and co-created by Darius, Derek Shawn, and me, Christopher Goffard.